after the event. I'm going to apologize in advance also for any ambient noise you might hear. My dog is squeaking his toy. I live in Brooklyn. There's open windows. It's noisy. It's Saturday night. So 1 second. I'm going to grab the toy from the dog. Okay. Sorry about that. So I'm going to be talking about scratch building single-sheathed car sides. This is an abbreviated version of a presentation I gave at Cocoa Beach back in January, and I've expanded a little bit on the portion related to the single-sheath car sides. And as I mentioned, I'm going to post the files, and I will also be going ahead and recording this as well. So let's get started. By the way, the photo you see on this slide here is an MKT car that I scratch built the sides for, probably going on about 12, 15 years ago now. And it was available as a kit. I hope to resuscitate that, but as a kit again, but I've got some other priorities lined up. So at some point I hope to get that back on the market. There are many people I would like to thank before we get started. A number of people here have been very helpful in kind of prodding me to get started in scratch building, including Lloyd, who is an absolute master pattern maker. Richard Hendrickson, who, when I lived in Northern California, was just an incredible mentor to me and really helpful in pushing me along, getting started not only in pattern making, but writing articles. Tom Madden in terms of casting and making patterns for casting. A lot of the people listed here have done casting for me, you know, and helped produce parts. So, you know, like anything that happens like this, it's a team effort. So the first thing I would like to talk about is, you know, we all have different kind of ends that we're trying to achieve. And I think that as you sit down and figure out scratch building, you really need to think about what it is you're trying to do, because that's going to guide the way you end up progressing. You know, if you're building a contest model, you know, to get points towards some type of goal with the NMRA, you're only going to build one model, and that's kind of going to be it. So the way you approach things would be different than someone who's making a pattern, you know, to produce cars for a layout. If you're interested in doing it to actually sell the models, you're going to take a different approach. And if it's just a fleet of cars for the layout, you're going to look at things differently. So I'm going to try to talk about some of those things. My experience, a lot of the patterns that I have done have been with the goal of ending up producing them for sales, but I've also done some things that have just been for personal use. So I can talk a little bit about both of those. Contests are not really my forte. So that's a place where you might want to consult your local NMRA to get some guidance on the best way to approach those. I am going to be talking about things that are kind of old school in the sense that you're sitting down, you're building from scratch with styrene. I know that today there are a lot better ways to do things with 3D modeling on computers, particularly for some, you know, complex curves and cast parts, you know, like door stops and things like that. So, you know, I fully embrace those things, but what I'm talking about here is just sitting down and making things from scratch with, you know, styrene or wood or whatever you have at hand. So, you know, your approach might differ if you're going to do it on a computer. One thing that's really going to guide the way you're doing things is if you're scratch building and you have a means to reproduce a part, I highly recommend going that route because it's really difficult to make two identical things. You know, you might be able to do it if you're making a little, you know, a door stop or a rib or something like that. As soon as you start getting into things like a car side or a car end, you're best to make one really high quality part and get it copied either by casting it yourself, you know, using micromark, or there's a lot of plastics retailers around the country, like Tap Plastics out on the West Coast, that sell the kits to do, you know, small batch castings. I highly recommend going that route. And if you are so inclined to really get into casting, I think Tom Madden's going to present a clinic at one of our upcoming events. So, but make one and duplicate it. That's my recommendation. Again, unless you're just building a contest model. Don't reinvent things that are already out there that you can use as a lever. You know, if there's a door roller or a rib or anything you can think of, harvest it from those parts, cut it off and glue it onto what you're doing, and focus your efforts on things that you actually do need to make from scratch. It'll save you time. If they're already high quality, there's no point trying to duplicate something that exists. So you know, focus your efforts where they're going to yield the biggest rewards, and leave stuff that's already been done aside and just use those. And you know, you may find things that are very representative of something you're trying to replicate, and maybe completely different. You know, you might find something on a military model that meets your needs, harvest it off that and use it, and just put it on your pattern and go from there. One of the things that I think we do is we really try to get things to be perfect. And I want you to disabuse that notion. Nothing is ever going to be perfect. The best patterns I've done are still littered with things that end up not being exactly right. However, I did put an asterisk here. There's one place where things are going to be noticeable immediately. And that's if you have like a vertically oriented structural member that ends up not being straight, the human eye is going to detect that immediately. Things that are supposed to be parallel are supposed to be parallel, and people are going to see it. So that's a place where you might have to fix it if you make a mistake. This is probably my biggest piece of advice. Analysis paralysis is the bane of scratch building. I spent literally years before I did my first set of patterns, thinking it over in my mind over and over. What's the best way to do this? How am I going to do it? And you find out that when you just sit down and do it, it ends up being the solutions come to you as you're making things, and you get through it and you look back and you're like, wow, why was I obsessing over that? If you've had children and you've read Oh, the Places You'll Go to Them by Dr. Seuss, The Waiting Place is good advice about this. Just roll up your sleeves, sit down and do it, and you'll find a solution, and it'll probably be a lot less painful than you thought it was going to be. And then, you know, if you're building models already, particularly if you've done a little kit bashing, you've built a resin kit or two, you've redetailed a locomotive, whatever, you probably already have the skills that you need, and the tools are probably sitting there on your workbench. Find a project and just dig in. You know, it might seem daunting when you look at it in total, like an entire freight car. But if you break it down into like a side, structural members, an underframe, things like that, it becomes far simpler and the solutions become far clearer to you. one of the things that you're definitely going to need to get started is reference material. And I've made patterns from many different ways. Ideally, you'd love to have blueprints and drawings. I've worked from diagram sheets with known dimensions. I've gone out and measured cars, like the New Haven flat car that I offered. I crawled under one of those. I've even worked from photos. The more information you have, the easier it's going to be. But sometimes you're not going to get that information. And depending upon what you're trying to do with the model, if it's just for your layout, if it's off by a couple inches, no one's going to care or notice. So work with what you have and don't obsess over trying to get perfect information. I am going to talk about a few things that I think are helpful. There are articles out there that are better than others in kind of getting your mindset into this. Bob Hundman did a lot of multi-part Scratchbuilding articles in Mainline Modeler over the years, many of them devoted to freight cars. Mark Feddersen and John Munson did some just incredible kit bashing articles in Mainline Modeler. Richard Hendrickson did a lot of kit bashing stuff, going back to Prototype Modeler, I believe was the name. It's been so long since I've thought about it. And I did some articles in Railroad Model Craftsman in the Essential Freight Cars series. And the Prototype Railroad Modeling Journal that I publish has had a lot of good content from people who have presented in this series in Hindsight. So, reading those things will get you familiar with materials and techniques and tools and all of those things. I've talked about some of these references already. They're noted here, particularly some of the industry publications like the Car Builders, Sykes, and Railway Age and such have a lot of great information. And a little bit about materials. I prefer to work with styrene as my primary, and then I use vinyl shim stock for certain things and brass shim stock as well. Work with whatever you have experience with and suits your comfort level. I know a lot of people who do great things with wood. Lloyd Kaiser was an absolute master with brass. So find something that works, that you're comfortable with, and just use it and go. So we're about to jump into kind of some of the more how I do things, but this is not the be all end all. It's just my thoughts on what I do. There are things I haven't tried or haven't done. Figure out what you do comfortably and go with that. And if you're just jumping in, start with something small. Scratch build a few details on a car and then go from there. And you can build up your bank of skills and experiences and go to more difficult projects. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that are specific to this in the following pages. I'm a big advocate of MEK. I use that for everything from as my solvent to glue things. I thin barge cement with it to make a glue. I clean my airbrush with it. It's kind of a do-all solvent. I learned about future floor wax years ago from the military modeling community, probably like 20 years ago or more. I use it as a gloss coat for applying decals. I will use it as an adhesive for details for dissimilar materials. So if you might have a little brass detail or vinyl or something, as it dries, it gets a little tacky and it'll hold something in place. And then when you put a coat of future floor wax over that after it's dried, it kind of seals it. And it's meant to be a protective layer for floors. So it certainly works as a protective layer for stuff on your models. When I apply Archer rivets, the last thing I will do is put a coat of future floor wax over them, just brushing it by hand. It dries very thin, and again, it protects those rivets, which are easy to flick off. And then, you know, the usual things, files, drills, brushes, cutting tools, et cetera, which most of you have. So one of the indispensable things is a set of calipers. And you can get pretty good calipers today for reasonable price. I think my last set, I probably spent about $60 on. I recommend getting stainless jaws. You can actually buy plastic calipers, which just seems ridiculous to me in terms of tolerances, but get stainless jaws. I recommend getting digital and being able to measure down to a 10,000th of an inch. And, you know, I convert all of my dimensions. So I generally work in scale dimensions, knowing that an inch is 1 divided by 87.1, which works out to about 11 thousandths. And then I you know, convert all of the scale dimensions to actual dimensions. And I use these calipers for laying things out. If you see that thumb screw on the top, that can be tightened so you can set a dimension and hold it. I do that pretty regularly. I also use squares, and I have, you know, you can buy a set of cheap squares, you know, that are made in India or Pakistan, and those work for a lot of basic things. I've also bought both Starrett and Brown & Sharp adjustable squares like the one you see here. And I use those for making sure that when I'm making patterns, things are square and aligned so that you don't run into that situation I talked about where a vertical member isn't quite vertical or not quite parallel to the one next to it. The chopper I use all the time. That's pretty much self-explanatory, as well as the shrew sander. While it doesn't relate to patterns, if you have flat resin kits, like I'll glue the sides back to back and get them to the exact same length using the true sander. So that, and then I'll just pop them apart. I glue them with just a few dots of ACC. And then when I glue the sides and ends together, I have what I know is a true rectangle by sanding the ends with the sander. Just briefly going to touch on this punch and die set. I use it all the time. It's great for making discs for things like the push-pull pockets that you see at the lower left corner, which I added to a DT&I gon. The holes for the tubes for the tie-down chains that you see at the left there were also punched out of styrene. This is available from a company called UMM USA, and I have their link at the end of this presentation. They sell a ton of different tools. They cater to the military community, but you know, a lot of these things have overlaps. I also use these etched scribers that you see here. They're actually etched metal parts that are about 5 thousandths thick, and they fit into an X-Acto handle. For me, they're better at creating kind of a rectangular trough rather than a V-shaped trough when you're scribing things. UMM USA also sells these too. Okay, so now we're about to start getting into the nuts and bolts of single sheath sides. A little bit about the prototypes. Most boards on single sheath cars, and I'm talking about box cars here, gons and hoppers are different, but are 5 1/4 inches wide. 5 1/8 and 3 1/4 are also common. Fortunately for us, 5 1/4 works out to 60 thousandths in HO scale, pretty close to it. I generally use 40 thousandths by 60 thousandths to create those boards. The side sills are typically 9-inch channel sections, so that fortunately also works out to 0.1 in HO scale, give or take 1,000th. The first thing I do is I start with a backing of evergreen styrene sheet that's 1/8 of an inch thick, which is 0.125. That's rigid enough so that it's generally not going to curl when you're gluing down board by board things, and board by board construction will curl if you don't put it against a rigid backing. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation, but starting with 1/8 inch thick styrene will really help to mitigate and eliminate that curling. The first thing you need to do is get that first board, in the case of my things, it's the side sill, straight, and then everything else flows from there. So I'm gonna jump into things here. One of the things that people will do, there are scribed styrene sheets available from purveyors like Evergreen. I tend not to like it because it really has that grooved look to it. If you look at the photo of the prototype car at the left, the TNNO car, you know, you can see where the boards are, you know, they overlap each other or abut each other, but it's not nearly as pronounced as what you see on that model here. That was, and the pattern for that was created using Evergreen scribed styrene. I just, you know, that's a look I don't prefer. Some people like it. It's just not my cup of tea. I'm going to be talking about primarily Z-bar structural members, which are kind of part of the foundation of modeling a single sheath side. I make them from 3 pieces of styrene. I make them from a 5/1000 piece of styrene base layer, which is 3 scale inches visible, plus 20 thousandths that'll end up being invisible. And then to that, I add a 20,000 square piece of strip. And then on top of that, I add a 1/3 strip. It's not exactly like a 3-inch Z-bar, but it's pretty darn close. This is the cross section of what that looks like. To make the strip, you see that 5,000 strip on the bottom that's 53 thousandths wide. I have a sheet of 5,000 strip that I use just for making custom strips. And so what I will do is I'll glue the strips that I need abutting up against, and just so you can see my cursor, I'm actually gonna, so I'll glue strips here and here. So in the case of trying to make this strip that's a 5,000 strip that's 53 thousandths wide, up against here, I'll glue a 20 thousandths by 20 thousandths here and a 20 thousandths by 20 thousandths here. And then I'll glue a 3-inch strip here and a 3-inch strip here. So that what will be visible here and here is 53 thousandths wide from the cut to this face. I'll then push my ruler, a steel ruler, up against this so that the only thing that will be visible will be this strip that you see here. I'll run my knife blade along it a couple times. 5 thousandths doesn't take much to cut it. I use a very sharp blade, and then that will give me that strip that I need. I trim it off at the ends and I'm ready to go. So the first thing I do when I'm making that side is I take one of my squares and I'll put this strip here, and this edge right here has to be straight. You want to start with a straight edge. And then I put my square up against it. You notice the square here is resting here. And then I'll go along the strip here. This is one of those 0.100 strips, which represents a 9-inch channel side sill. And I'll glue this strip using this edge here as a guide so that it's perfectly straight all the way across here. And the distance from here to here is the same there as it is from here to here or from here to here. It's consistent all the way across so that I know I've got a perfectly straight edge there. The next thing I'll do is create all of the actual wood boards, because that first strip that you saw is actually steel. It's a steel channel section. So now I'll create the boards. I like to texture the surface of the boards. I know it can be a little caricaturish because really in HO scale you wouldn't see this, but it lends a little bit of character to what you're looking at. And I'll put a bunch of them on the workbench and texture them all at once rather than texturing them individually. If you texture them individually, because of the way your finger applies pressure, it actually rounds the edges and you end up with sort of those rounded boards like you see at the lower right. I'll texture them, pick them up, and kind of drop them on my workbench like pickup sticks so that I'm randomly picking them up. And then I'll start gluing them, and I'm going to use my cursor again. So what you see here is that channel side sill that we wanted to get straight. And then I will carefully just start gluing the boards one after another, and I'll apply pressure downward as I'm doing it with a ruler, not too hard because the styrene, as you glue it, it gets a little soft in the center, with enough pressure to push them one against the other, but not so much that I'm squeezing up the styrene that's been melted in between these gaps. And then I just build the number of boards up as I go that I need. And you can count them. The top board here is usually the one that I fudge on a little bit, because over the course of all of these boards, the difference between 60 thousandths and the actual 5 1/4 inch dimension will add up, so that you could be off by 10 thousandths by the time you get up here. And I'll adjust this one so that it's the kind of the proper size to get the actual car height that I need. And then this top plate here, I'll adjust so that the height from the bottom of the side sill to the top of that side plate matches the prototype. And then I'll start laying out my structural members. And if this right here, your side sill is straight relative to the bottom of your 1/8 inch backing sheet. So if I put a square up here, the squares that I showed you before, it's going to be perpendicular to here and perpendicular to your side sill. So what I'll do is I'll use the calipers and measure out using the center line that I notched using an X-Acto blade. And I'll show you in a second how the calipers will like kind of nest in that cut. And then I just set those dimensions and put the caliper on this side and put my square on this side. And then once I've got it all set with my square in place, I'll just touch a little bit of MEK at several places here. If you put too much, it's going to flood under and you're going to have the markings from your square on the side of your model. So you want to go sparingly until you get it tacked in place, and then you can apply more solvent. So this shows you here, I've got the center line there, and one of those kind of jaws of the caliper is resting in that center line, and then the other one is right up against the dimension that I need to match. And you can dial those dimensions in and then lock them in place. So it's nesting in this groove here. It will be set here so that I know that doorpost dimension exactly. And then I can use this thumb screw. Once I set the dimension here, I can use that thumb screw to lock it in place and go from there. Okay. So I set those dimensions and then I start adding my structural members. The Z-bars are created exactly as I showed you. I generally build the Z-bars on the car side, so I will not add an assembly. I'll actually add a 5 thousandths by 53 strip, then I'll add the 20 by 20, then I'll add the 1 by 3. So what you see here is how I do that. I'm adding the diagonals, and the diagonals I usually add by sight. Based upon prototype photos and drawings. So these are 5 thousandths by 53 thousandths strips that I've glued in place. Here's a close-up of it here. And I did the same thing with the vertical horizontal members where I'll add this 5 thousandths strip, and then the next thing I'll do is add the 20 by 20 that, provides the relief for that Z. And then I'll cap it with a 1x3 as shown there. And then once I've got those in place, I'll go back and trim them to shape. And as you see at the photo on the bottom right, if you look at the bottom, the structural members on this car actually had that like angular shape at the bottom. This is for a Central Vermont single sheath box car. And I'll trim them at the top as well. What you see here is basically the main side pattern complete. I haven't added any of the other details, but all the structural members are in place and everything's ready to be detailed now. This is a Milwaukee 50-foot single sheath car that I'm going to be releasing. So all of the details that you then have to add, the structural members are secured to the sheathing using carriage bolts. I generally just simulate those with our rivets harvested from an Athearn snowplow. I use a chisel blade to remove them and then glue them on one by one. The metal sections, like along the side sill and the side plate at the top, those are actual rivets. I still use, again, the Athearn rivets. All the plates, fixtures, and angles, like the grain bulge plates at the bottom, things like that, I add those from styrene and add rivets. I do fill in the door opening. You see those 3 horizontal strips. We tend to grab models with our thumb and forefinger at the doors. And if there's nothing backing it, you handle it enough and eventually those doors will start to bow in. On this particular model, I actually added the places over here. You can see where the sill steps are gonna go and the ladder mounts. It depends, some models I'll do that, some I won't. This is a Northern Pacific car that actually had 3 1/4 sheathing boards. I actually cut all of these out individually from 5,000 styrene strip and glued them in place, the same way I did with the 60,000 strips, but these happened to be HO scale 3 1/4. I think the effect was pretty good for that. It's obviously time consuming because you have to cut all of those strips individually, but it's worth it in the end. One thing that I generally do is I will leave off things where you have overlaps at the corners. And in particular, I want to point out these straps here on single sheath cars, they actually overlap here. And you have these like junctions at the corner that are usually they're pressed shapes. Sometimes they're castings, but you notice they overlap a lot of the area here. And if you have a flat resin kit, those things are actually cut. So part of it is on the side and part of it is on the end, whereas on the prototype, they were actually continuous. And so I'll try to add those as I build up the body. You notice these red parts here, those are actually, that's vinyl shim stock, but those are one continuous piece the way it was on the prototype. It just, it's a nice finishing touch to do them as a single part rather than to have them cut. So I wanted to very briefly talk about double-sided single sheath cars. If you're making a model that's not a flat kind of closed car like a single sheath box or automobile car, you need to think about both the interior and the exterior. And as you're doing it, things are going to curl. Styrene, as you glue boards along an adjacent edge, it curls and warps, and so that creates problems. There are kind of 2 ways to do that. One is to create, using that rigid styrene backing that I showed, create a veneer of boards that you can then copy cast in resin and then glue them back to back. That's the way a lot of manufacturers who have done like wood-sided gons, you end up with 2 pieces. One is the face of the gon, and then the other is the interior. The other thing you can do, if you have it, is something that's a more rigid structure that will prevent that curling, like this. This is an Intermountain gon that I use as the basis for a Litchfield and Madison gon, and I actually added individual styrene boards, and because of the structure of the sides, it prevented it from curling and warping. One of the cars that I would like to try this technique on long term is a Southern Pacific hog car, they took a lot of single sheath cars and rebuilt them into basically open top cars with hinged doors on the sides for essentially wood chips that were burned as quote unquote hog fuel. They're like the precursor to today's wood pellets, essentially. But what I'd like to do is create essentially a side of all of these sheathing boards, cast that, using 10,000 strip, cast that, and then on the outer face, do all of these structural members. The cars didn't have these doors. They actually had hinged doors. And then also use this same sheathing boards flipped around for the interior of the car. And then you build the cross members and you have a car with an open roof. So essentially I'll be doing an intermediate set of castings. And that way I know it won't warp the way it would if I were trying to do 10,000 strips on both the inside and the outside, and I would end up with a mess. If you're interested in these cars, Tony Thompson's book on Southern Pacific Freight Cars, Volume 3, has quite a bit of information about them. So that covers the kind of the pattern making for these. I did mention a little bit at the outset a couple of resources. One, I use Archer a lot for rivets. I primarily use Archer for what I'll call regular rivets, where you have spacing, like on a steel car or a cross bearer or things like that, where you need things that are laid out where you have 30 rivets at a set spacing that you want to just apply all at once. For things, individual ones like carriage bolts on single sheath cars, I just glue Athearn rivets on individually. And then I mentioned the tools. UMM USA really has a great selection of things that are just incredibly useful for scratch building and modeling. They have micro saws and scribers and the punch and die, all kinds of different things. So I absolutely recommend going there. And then, as I mentioned, this will be posted to my blog. This is being recorded, so it will be available for you to go back and reference. And the photo you see here is a Père Marquette car that I also scratch built the patterns for. I didn't cover these hat section structural members in this presentation. That's something I can do as an adjunct, perhaps on my blog in the future for people who are wondering how to do those. And that covers the presentation. I will be happy to answer questions now if Ryan wants to go ahead and queue them up and fire away.
Okay, I'm back on here. Okay, so first question I got here is, whoa, it just bounced away. Using 1/8 styrene as a stiff backing for the side and styrene for the side, how do you release the side from the backer?
Oh, I should have, thank you. That's actually logic. I don't. Those are things that would be used for making a mold using silicone. I think one thing you could do, if that is your want, the problem is if the styrene isn't attached to that backing, it's going to curl of its own accord. You could try to put a layer of wax paper between there, and I think what you could do is that side sill that I showed you, that's kind of the foundational step, you could glue one of those to the side, the styrene backing, and then nest a piece of wax paper against that, and then start building from there, and just kind of use masking tape to keep your structure, your sheathing boards in place. You just want to make sure that you don't have any glue seep under and glue itself to that that foundational piece that you use. But I've built things using wax paper before, and it's pretty good at keeping things separate and allowing you to then remove them when you're done. You really have to watch that curling though, because it does happen. It's hard to avoid.
All right. Next question. Where do you get the vinyl shim stock and in what thickness? And I think there's a second question of what do you use to glue the vinyl shim stock?
So the vinyl shim stock, as well as my brass shim stock, I have purchased from Small Parts, and it comes, I actually have it sitting here. So this is a 6x18 sheet of 3/1000 brass. And I have the brass and vinyl in 1/1000s, 1.5 thousandths, 2/1000s, 3/1000s, and 4/1000s. I've gotten it from a company called Small Parts in the past. Amazon acquired them. I don't buy anything from Amazon anymore. I do get stuff from McMaster Carr, and I believe McMaster Carr has those things as well. In terms of gluing that stuff, my approach is generally to use barge cement or Walther's Goo, and they're essentially the same types of adhesives, thinned with MEK, so I can brush it on, and it holds pretty well. It even, you know, if you apply it well, it will hold up to making a mold around it.
Okay. I'd just like to add, I buy my brass shim stock from McMaster Carr. It's easy to get from them. Micro mark rivets, how do they compare to the Archers? And how do you decide when to use a decal rivet versus a harvest rivet?
So I have to confess, I've never used Micromark. And my statement on Archer, I invested a lot of money with Archer years ago. When he first came out, I saw the benefit, and I had him do many 8.5x11 sheets of rivets for me in custom spacings. And he ended up releasing a lot of the spacings that I wanted, and he really fleeced me in the process, and I was not all that happy about it. I paid a fortune for stuff that I could have gotten for a lot less. But that said, when do I use them? For things like on the side of a pattern, I use the Athern rivets a lot, just because you're looking at irregular spacings and things that are just not, they're irregular in their application. And it's very easy to just grab one Athern rivet at a time. I know this is going to sound nuts, but I'll carve a bunch of them off a Athern snowplow, put them on a sheet of white paper, and then touch the edge with an X-Acto blade that I've touched to my tongue to get a little saliva on it. And then I just glue them down that way. You know, you put a dot of MEK where you want it to go, touch it, it sticks. And then I go back and apply a little bit more. That's one of the places that I'll cover up with Future also, to kind of seal them in place so that they're not going to pop off. Where I use the Archer rivets, I think I mentioned, you know, if you've got a car side that requires, you know, 40 rivets across the entire top to bottom length, and you want them to be spaced exactly right, you're crazy to try and glue the Atherns in that place. I've done it, but you know, the Archers are just, you know, much easier. I'm sure Micromark is using the same technology, and I'm sure that if you've bought decals from Tishy, you know how they're more like a deposited waxy ink rather than like a true ink. I'm sure they're all printing the same way, and so Micromark is probably, you know, equivalent 6 of one, half dozen of the other compared to all the others.
Yeah, I can add to that. I've used the Micromark ones and the Archer ones. The Micromark HL scale rivet head is slightly bigger, maybe a couple thou bigger, and there are different spacings on there than the Archer has. So depending on your application, it may work, right? So, or if you're trying to match up to rivets on a specific car brand, they may fit better than the Archer ones, right? So next question, why the Athern snowplow versus other cars?
Because if you got an Athern undecorated snowplow, it would give you more rivets per surface than pretty much anything else in the Athern line. And years ago, 20 years ago, I ordered what will probably be a lifetime supply of Athearn snowplow shells at like $1.25 each or whatever. But yeah, it's just because of the quantity that's on that side.
Okay. Next question. How are the little tabs at the bottom of the sheathing creating? I think they're talking about maybe like the grain clips along the side sill to the first board.
So if it's these, I think those are 5,000 styrene. That is the dimension that kind of matches, and for some of them, you might have a dimension on a drawing. For others, I'm just eyeballing it. But yeah, those grain clips, I just estimate what looks right, and that I'll lay it on the side of the pattern and look at it and say, does this look like the prototype photo? Does this look like the drawing? If I don't have a dimension, and once I feel like I've nailed it, I glue them on. These are more of those things where I will make the strips, custom width strips using 5,000 styrene. I go through a lot of 5,000 styrene strips over the course of a year with all of my model building, because I'm constantly making, custom width strips.
Is there a use for MBW castings in the process?
Yes, certainly a wood-sided car that had grab irons attached to the wood sheathing, those were generally NBWs, and I apply those where necessary. The other thing that I didn't mention, well, I'll close the thought on the NBWs. I use those. Detail Associates had the best NBWs, I thought, in terms of size and fidelity. Turns out that Grantline actually offers the exact same thing. I didn't know it at the time. So you can still get them fairly easily. The Detail Associates ones are only available on eBay, and they go for ridiculous amounts. The Grantline ones that are the exact same part go for quite a bit less. The other thing I failed to mention, when I showed that punch and die, as a matter of fact, let me quickly go back and see if I have the, because one of the things that I use that punch and die for, no, I didn't do it on this car, but a lot of times grab irons were not applied with NBWs. The grab was a casting, and this part of the casting, this little round circle here, was attached to the grab. The grab was a casting, and that was actually, round portion had a hole in it, and there would be a rivet that would pass through there. What I will use this punch and die for is I'll glue in the grabs, and I'll actually punch these really small discs and glue them adjacent to where the grab attaches, and then I'll glue an Athearn rivet in the center. So yeah, you have to look at photos. Sometimes what looks like it might be an NBW is actually not an NBW, and you can model it this way.
Okay. Taking to heart your advice to reuse something already done, did you make a master for the B50-4 Z-brace side? Then it says B50-14, so I'm guessing that's a correction.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that.
Did you make a master for the B50-14 Z-brace side?
Oh, that model that I showed is actually the old Sunshine kit, so I have not done anything with that. But I do have, except for a couple of patterns that accidentally were destroyed, all of the things that I've done, I still have the sides for. So like this Pear Marquette model, I do have this side, I actually still have this body too, the master body. So yeah, all of those sides exist. I would like to at some point do the B50, 13 and 14, because I think those could be improved upon.
Okay. If you were doing a stock car side instead, how do you keep the sides from curling?
If it were, for a pattern, I would do it the same way as I showed here, just, applying the spacers kind of behind the structural members to space out the sheathing boards. If I were not doing that, I would go using that wax paper method. And I think one thing that might end up I'm going to try it with some projects that I have coming up, is to actually do etched structural members, to do kind of those free, if you're not making it for a pattern, if you're actually building the model, to do like free, freestanding, not applied to a backing like I do for patterns, and do etched structural members that you could bend into the right shape and then use them to help keep some rigidity. I would also recommend going back to, because Bob Hundman, even though he worked in styrene, most of his articles for Scratchbuilding were building a model and not building a pattern. And so he, you can use the techniques that he used to build those models and avoid curling and bowing and things. He did build the stock car, a Burlington stock car, so that would probably be a good reference article for that particular question as well.
Okay. Next question, are the doors made the same way as the sides, or do you use scribe siding?
So for the doors, I do use scribed styrene, because the way they look to me, they look like they were made differently. And so what you see here, this is actually 20 thousandths scribed styrene. And then, things like these door rollers, these were harvested from Grantline doors. The latching stuff was harvested from other doors. Everything else is made from scratch. But for those, I do use scribed styrene, because the doors look like they were made from something different to my eye. They don't look like they were board by board like the sheathing.
Okay, last question we got. How does the mold release from underneath the Z-brace? Probably a question actually better served for Tom Madden.
Yeah, I mean, you can talk about flexibility of resin cast, the molds and the silicone and everything.
Yeah. Let's tune in next month. I'm sure Tom will be happy to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, I can, generally when I'm doing these things, I will, if it's outside of my previous expertise and experience, I'll consult with someone. But generally resin casting, the molds are silicone. And while, production rubbers can be pretty rigid, they have enough give that they can kind of get in there and then pull out. And Tom next month will talk to you about, things that you can do, like, whether it's better to remove a part from a mold or a mold from a part, and durometer of resins and silicone and things like that. But it's far more forgiving, obviously, than hard tooling used for injection molding. So you can get away with some of those undercuts and things, and that's the beauty of resin.
Do you bevel the board edges?
I do not. And when you're gluing them the way I do it, you get enough relief, as you can see on this Paramarquette car, that you can see that there are individual boards there, but they're tight the way they're supposed to be. No, I don't, because I think that would take me into the realm of like scribe styrene, like evergreen, which is what I'm trying to avoid. If that's what you want, I would recommend going with evergreen and using sandpaper to kind of take some of the surface off to make it a little less pronounced, but still present. And you would probably get the effect you're looking for without having to bevel the boards.
Okay, that's the last question that's come through. Thank you very much, Ted. That was excellent.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tolerating the noises of Brooklyn and my dog, who spent the entire clinic on my lap so he wouldn't bark. Appreciate it.
Okay, Jerry, do you have any final words?
Well, wow, that's number 3, right? That's the third one down.